Hi everybody, are we ready for another little cardinal story time? Awesome! Are you in a good comfy spot and ready to hear our story? Great! This week we will be talking about a person who we are actually celebrating on Monday. On January 18th, which is the third Monday of the month, all Americans celebrate a very special man. But before we talk about who that person is, let's see if you can figure it out after our story. This story will actually talk about that person that we are going to celebrate on Monday, so let's see if you can pay attention and find out who that person is. Belle, the Last Mule at Gee's Bend, a civil rights story. Alex sat on a bench outside the store. He wanted to go and play, but his mother had told him to wait for her. There was nothing to do on the porch but watch an old mule. You see the mule? Eating in the garden across the street. There was no breeze, not a leaf moved in the chinaberry trees. It was so still that Alex could hear the mule munching on a row of bright collared greens. He watched as the mule's big fuzzy ears twitched away a pesky fly. So here's Alex. He's sitting on the bench outside the store, and there's the mule munching on the collard greens. Kind of like lettuce. An old woman walked slowly up the wooden steps to the store and sat down on the bench next to Alex. She fanned herself with a folded newspaper. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye. She was watching the mule too. The old woman chuckled and then said in a soft voice, "Myself, I like my collards cooked with some ham and spiced with vinegar." Alex smiled. "I was just thinking how that old mule sure can eat collards," said the woman. "Is it allowed to? I mean, eat someone's garden like that?" asked Alex. "Oh, Belle, she can have all the collards she wants. She's earned it." The woman looked straight at Alex and said, "I let her loose, you see, and that's my garden. I thought I'd just sit in the shade and rest a bit before I shoot her out." "But ma'am, why do you let the mule eat all your collard plants?" "My name's Miss Petway, son," she said. "What's yours?" "I'm Alex," he answered. "Well, Alex, there's enough greens in my garden for both of us, and Belle's a very special mule. She's a hero here in Gee's Bend. I like to show her some respect." "What's so special about that old mule?" Alex asked as he stood up. The woman took a deep breath. "Now, that's a long story, but if you have some time to sit," she patted the bench. Alex hesitated. He wondered if she was just a crazy old lady, but he was curious, and after all, there was nothing else to do. "Gee's Bend has always been poor," she began. "There's not much here but farmland. We always needed mules to help us work the land. Not many of us could afford a car." "How could you get anywhere?" Alex asked. "Well, that's just it. Benders, that's what we call ourselves here, use the mules to haul most everything. Belle's been with us for many years now. She was here the day Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to speak to us, way back in 1965. "I know about Dr. Martin Luther King from school. Did you get to meet him?" Alex asked. "Oh, yes, sir, I did. That night there was a terrible storm. Lots of people thought he wouldn't make it to see us poor folks. I waited not far from here with Belle. It was past midnight when Dr. King finally arrived, but he still spoke to us that night. Nearly took off the roof of Pleasant Grove Baptist Church with his wonderful words." "What did he say?" "Well, in those days we had a ferry to cross the river into Camden, where there were jobs and stores. Dr. King told us to take the ferry to Camden and register to vote. 'Cross the river for freedom,' he sang out that night. Even though we were poor dirt farmers, descendants of slaves, with only mules to carry our loads, he said, 'I come over here to Gee's Bend to tell you, you are somebody.' He told us that we had a right to vote. You understand, Alex, back then no black person from Wilcox County had ever dared to vote. Were you scared? Alex asked. So here's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the church telling all the people of Gee's Bend that they should go across the river and vote. Miss Pedway sighed and thought for a moment. I don't think we were scared, not after Dr. King spoke to us. We felt strong like our mules, and we did just what he told us to do. So many went to register that we almost swamped that little ferry. Some Benders went on the march with Dr. King in Selma, in Montgomery, in Birmingham, and in the March on Washington. Benders are loyal like mules, too, Miss Pedway added, not chuckling. We read about all those marches in school, Alex nodded. But we must have scared the white folks in Camden, because the next thing we knew, they shut down the ferry. The white sheriff was a big bully who wanted to keep us in our place. He told reporters we didn't close the ferry because they were black. We closed it because they forgot they were black. Does that seem like a nice thing to do? They weren't doing anything bad. They were just going to register to vote. So when it came time to vote, we had no way to cross the river. Because remember, they can't get on the ferry now. But we wouldn't be stopped. Benders, which remember, those are the people that live in Gee's Bend, are like old Belle here. Not fancy, but strong and steady. And stubborn. We filled our few cars with as many people as could fit. And then our mules carried the wagon loads of people round the river all day to vote. It took half a day to get there, but it was worth it. We sang and clapped all the way into town. Folks in Camden sure were surprised. You showed them, Alex laughed. Is that why Belle's your hero? Well, there's more to it. A lot of people here lost their jobs in Camden because they voted. Things got bad. With no jobs, we had no money for food. Some of us joined the Freedom Quilting Bee in Alberta, and eventually we started our own. Called ourselves the Gee's Bend Quilters. You see, the women of Gee's Bend had always made quilts. Some of the most beautiful quilts in the world were made right here. Soon they were being sold all over the United States. We became famous. That's why I'm here. My mother came here to shop for a quilt today, Alex explained. That's a happy ending, isn't it? So they didn't have any jobs, so they went to work doing what they knew best, and they were making quilts. But that's not the end of the story for Belle, Miss Pedway's voice turned softer. Alex, do you remember learning in school what happened on the 4th of April in 1968? Alex looked into Miss Pedway's eyes and saw how sad they looked. That's when Dr. King got shot, isn't it? He asked, and for the first time, he felt the sadness for himself. Yes, everyone in Gee's Bend was grieved. Miss Pedway took a deep breath and looked at the trees. A slight breeze seemed to shuffle the leaves. We got a phone call asking if our mules could pull Dr. King's coffin through the streets of Atlanta during the funeral parade. They wanted to use our mules, not fancy draft horses. Mules take their time, work hard, and they never back down. Mules aren't pretty, but they are somebody. It meant so much to us that Benders could honor the memory of Dr. King. There's Miss Pedway with her mule. You remember Belle? Belle and another mule named Ada were loaded onto a truck to begin their journey to Atlanta. But, as usual, it wasn't going to be easy. State policemen stopped the truck and asked the drivers to show them a permit, that means they had a slip of paper giving them permission, for hauling livestock across state lines. They threatened to arrest the drivers when they didn't have the papers, told them they'd have to turn back. We got the word to Dr. King's headquarters in Atlanta about what had happened, and they called the state police and governors of Alabama and Georgia. They told them that it would look shameful on TV and in the news all over the nation if they refused to let our mules pull the funeral train. After that, the troopers escorted Belle and Ada right into Atlanta. Belle pulled Dr. Martin Luther King's coffin. Alex asked, Yes, sir. Belle and Ada bravely pulled the wagon 3.5 miles through the streets that were full of grieving, weeping people. As they passed, people reached out and touched the mules and the casket. Imagine the thousands of arms and hands reaching out to them. But they kept moving, slow and steady. They didn't back down or get scared, just kept going. The funeral was televised around the world. 60,000 people gathered around the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and tens of thousands more lined the streets. We were very proud, and that's why we love our last mule here at G's Bend, and why I let Belle eat all the collard greens she wants. Here's an illustration of the funeral. You see Belle and Ada pulling. There's the casket that had Martin Luther King Jr. in it. Alex and Miss Petway turned and looked at old Belle, who stopped to look at them. They both laughed. "Yep, she's had her fill," Miss Petway said, slowly rising off the bench. "Want to go meet her?" "Yes, ma'am." Alex skipped down the steps and over to Belle, who let him scratch her fuzzy ears. Alex looked into the mule's eyes and thought about all the history she had seen. Thank you for telling me about Belle," Alex said. "Now you know what Dr. King meant when he told us, even though we led simple, hard lives, we were still somebody," she said. "And even an old mule can be a hero," Alex added. Miss Pedway smiled and walked away, leading Belle behind her. So mules, even though they're not as tall and pretty as horses, or maybe they're not as soft to touch, they're hard working and always get the job done, just like the people of G's Bend. In the back of this book, we have an author's note. I'm going to read it to you now. Author's note. I first heard the story of Belle from Reverend James E. Orange, who had been working for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When the civil rights leader was assassinated on April 4, 1968, it had been Dr. King's wish that mules pull the farm wagon that would hold his burial casket. He had spent his life working to improve the lives of poor black people. The mules would be a power symbol. Reverend Orange had the job of finding the mules. He remembered that the King had spoken at G's Bend on several occasions and that members of the community had marched in protest with him elsewhere. He knew that Dr. King had long admired the Benders, remember that's what the people of G's Bend were called, who lived simply and had faced hard times. The people of G's Bend and their mules would play a big part in Martin Luther King Jr.'s history, just as he had in theirs. Indeed, one of the first African Americans to cast his vote after the passage of the National Voting Rights Act of 1965 was in Camden, Alabama, which is where the people of G's Bend had taken the ferry to register to vote. A few years later, Camden elected the first black sheriff of the 20th century. When news of King's assassination came, the Benders readily agreed to send 2 mules, Belle and Ada. The animals were loaded into a pickup and began the journey. The truck was stopped at the state border, and when the driver could not produce a permit to ship the livestock, he was refused permission to drive on to Atlanta. Phone calls were made from King's staff to the governors of both Alabama and Georgia to ask for assistance. Knowing that this action threatened to delay the funeral and make national news, the 2 governors agreed that the Benders would be allowed to drive the mules on to Atlanta. On April 9, 1968, Belle and Ada pulled the humble funeral wagon on a long, slow trek from Ebenezer Baptist Church to Morehouse College, where one of King's teachers, Reverend Benjamin Mays, delivered his eulogy. It is estimated that 50,000 people marched in quiet procession behind the wagon. Belle and Ada had completed their part in the history of this great man. And that was written by Calvin Alexander Ramsey, one of the authors of this book. Here we have an actual photograph of Ada and Belle pulling Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s casket in the parade. You see the mules? And that is the story of Belle, the last mule at G's Bend. What did you think of that story? Yeah, a lot was happening in the 1960s. So did you figure out who we are celebrating and remembering on January 18th? That's right, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a very special man, and if you are wanting more information on him, we have several books here at the library that you can check out. You can stop by and get those or request them for curbside pickup. If you are needing anything else, please be sure to reach out to us here at the library.